In a small roadside diner, a group of bikers made the grave mistake of humiliating an elderly black man. It all started with a simple bump, just an innocent collision, but the bikers turned it into a spectacle, mocking him and spitting in his coffee. What they didn't know was that this man was a decorated Vietnam veteran, and they would soon bitterly regret disturbing the quiet solace of his daily coffee. Route 66 diner glowed in the late afternoon, light streaming through the large windows and bathing the worn leather booths in a golden warmth. Charlie Jones, a veteran with weathered hands and a face etched with the lines of experience, pushed open the glass door of the diner. The bell above chimed softly, announcing his arrival. Charlie's signature cap, adorned with pins and patches from his military service, sat firmly on his head as he stepped inside, his eyes taking a moment to adjust to the dimmer interior. As Charlie moved further into the diner, he stumbled slightly, his hand reaching out to steady himself against a nearby chair. He found himself face to face, or rather face to chest, with a mountain of a man. The stranger towered over Charlie, his broad shoulders stretching the limits of a well-worn leather jacket. But it wasn't the man's imposing size that immediately caught Charlie's attention. It was the fierce red dragon emblazoned on the back of the jacket, its eyes seeming to glow with an inner fire. The biker's face contorted into a scowl, his eyes narrowing as he glared down at Charlie. When he spoke, his voice was a low growl, like distant thunder promising a storm. "Look where you're walking, old man," the biker snarled, his words dripping with barely contained aggression. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The gentle hum of conversation in the diner faltered, then ceased altogether. The only sound was the soft sizzle from the kitchen and the suddenly loud ticking of the clock on the wall. Charlie straightened himself, squaring his shoulders in a posture that spoke of years of military discipline. He opened his mouth to respond, to diffuse the situation with a polite apology. But the biker wasn't finished. "Hunchman can't see straight," the biker muttered, his voice loud enough to carry across the now silent diner. "Might better kiss my boots." The insults hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Charlie's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek as he fought to maintain his composure. His eyes, which had seen horrors most could never imagine, remained steady, meeting the biker's hostile gaze without flinching. For a long moment, the two men stood locked in a silent battle of wills. The other patrons watched with bated breath, tension thick in the air. It was a powder keg of a situation, needing only the smallest spark to explode into violence. But Charlie, drawing upon reserves of patience and self-control, honed through years of service and hardship, chose a different path. Without a word, he carefully sidestepped the biker, his movements slow and deliberate. He could feel the man's presence behind him, like a looming thundercloud threatening to unleash its fury. Charlie made his way to his usual window booth, each step measured and controlled. He could feel the eyes of every patron following his progress, could sense the biker's glare boring into his back. But he didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge the tension that thrummed through the diner like a plucked guitar string. As he settled into his familiar seat, Charlie allowed himself a small sigh of relief. He glanced out the window, taking in the view of the parking lot and the stretch of Route 66 beyond. It was a view he had come to appreciate over the years, a reminder of the vastness of the world and the journeys that brought people to this very spot. From his peripheral vision, Charlie noticed the biker moving past his table, shooting him a final glaring look before sitting down a few tables away. Charlie observed discreetly as two more bikers joined the first, their leather jackets bearing the same fierce red dragon insignia. One of the bikers caught Charlie staring and nudged his companions. Charlie quickly averted his gaze, choosing instead to study the familiar layout of the diner. His eyes traveled over the dessert display case near the counter, filled with an enticing array of pies and cakes. He took in the worn but clean booths, each one holding countless stories of conversations shared and meals enjoyed. Charlie's gaze finally settled back on his own booth. He had chosen this spot strategically years ago, appreciating the clear view it offered of both the entrance and the parking lot. It was a habit born from his military days, always aware of his surroundings, always prepared for the unexpected. As he sat there, Charlie could feel the weight of the bikers' presence a few tables away. Their loud voices and occasional bursts of laughter seemed to grate against the usually peaceful atmosphere of the place. Charlie found himself unconsciously straightening his posture, his body tensing slightly, as if preparing for a confrontation he hoped would not come. As Charlie waited for the familiar face of Emily, the young waitress, to appear, he couldn't shake the feeling that this ordinary afternoon was about to become anything but ordinary. The gentle hum of conversation gradually returned to the diner, though it remained subdued, as if the patrons were afraid to disturb the uneasy peace that had settled over the establishment. Charlie sat quietly in his booth, his weathered hands resting on the worn tabletop, fingers drumming a silent, contemplative rhythm. The sound of approaching footsteps drew Charlie's attention away from his thoughts. Emily, a young waitress with kind eyes and a warm smile, approached his table. Her uniform, a pale blue dress with a crisp white apron, seemed to brighten the atmosphere around her. She moved with a grace that spoke of years of navigating the narrow spaces between tables and booths. "Good afternoon, Charlie," Emily greeted him, her voice carrying a cheerful note that seemed to push back against the lingering tension in the air. Her smile widened as she recognized the regular customer, a fondness evident in her eyes. "Coffee and grilled cheese as usual." Charlie opened his mouth to respond with his typical affirmative, but Emily's eyes suddenly lit up with an excitement that gave him pause. She leaned in slightly, as if about to share a secret. "Oh, wait!" she exclaimed, her voice lowered but brimming with enthusiasm. "I almost forgot. We have a new special today. Would you like to hear about it?" Intrigued by her obvious excitement, Charlie nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He had always appreciated Emily's youthful energy and dedication to her job. It reminded him of the passion he once had for his own work, back when the world seemed full of possibilities. "What's the occasion?" he asked. Emily's eyes sparkled as she began to explain, her words tumbling out in a rush of pride. "I've been working on perfecting my apple pie recipe for months now," she said, her hands moving animatedly as she spoke. "I've tried different combinations of apples, adjusted the spices, even experimented with the crust. And finally, I think I've got it just right." Charlie listened attentively, touched by the young woman's enthusiasm. It was moments like these that made the diner feel like a second home to him, a place where small joys were celebrated and shared. Emily continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I baked a fresh batch this morning, and it's been selling like crazy. In fact," she paused for dramatic effect, "there's only one uncut piece left." She leaned in even closer, a mischievous glint in her eye. "Since you're one of our most loyal customers, I'd be happy to give you an extra large slice of that last piece. What do you say? Want to try something new today?" Charlie considered for a moment, his eyes drifting to the dessert case where he could just make out the golden brown crust of the remaining pie. He was a creature of habit, and his usual grilled cheese had been his go-to order for years. It was a comfortable choice, a small constant in a world that often felt chaotic and unpredictable. But as he looked back at Emily's hopeful face, he felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun streaming through the window. This young woman had put her heart into creating something special, and she wanted to share it with him. In that moment, Charlie realized that sometimes stepping out of one's comfort zone could lead to unexpected joys. "You know what, Emily?" Charlie said, his voice warm with affection. "I think I'll give that apple pie a try." Emily's face lit up with a smile that seemed to brighten the entire diner. "Wonderful!" she exclaimed, barely containing her excitement. "I'll bring you your coffee right away, and then I'll get that pie sliced up for you. You won't regret it, Charlie, I promise." As Emily turned to head back to the counter, her step light with happiness, Charlie's attention was drawn to the biker's table. The three men were eyeing the dessert shelf hungrily, their earlier aggressions seemingly forgotten in the face of potential sweets. Emily approached their table, her professional smile in place despite the earlier confrontation. Charlie watched as she took out her notepad, ready to take their order. "What can I get for you gentlemen today?" Emily's voice carried across the diner, maintaining its friendly tone despite the palpable tension. The biker's eyes roamed over the dessert shelf, and one of the bikers, the large one who had bumped into Charlie earlier, leaned forward, his voice carrying across the diner. "We'll take that last piece of apple pie," he demanded, his tone gruff and impatient. Emily's smile faltered for just a moment before she regained her composure. "I'm sorry, sir, but that piece has already been sold to another customer. We do have a fresh batch baking in the kitchen, though. It should be ready in about 30 minutes if you'd like to wait." The biker's face darkened at her words. "We don't want to wait 30 minutes. Let the other customer wait for the new one." Emily stood her ground, her voice steady as she explained, "I'm sorry, but it's our policy to serve on a first-come, first-served basis. It wouldn't be fair to give away an order that's already been placed." The tension in the air thickened as the bikers exchanged glances. The one with Razor emblazoned on his vest leaned forward, his voice low and threatening. "Look, sweetheart, that's a big piece of pie. You could easily split it into 2 portions, one for us, one for your regular customer." His eyes flicked towards Charlie's table, making it clear he knew exactly who had ordered the pie. Emily's gaze followed Razor's, and Charlie could see the concern in her eyes as she looked back at him. She was caught between her duty to her customers and her fear of the increasingly hostile bikers. "I'm sorry, gentlemen, but I can't do that," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The pie has been reserved for one of our regulars. Perhaps I could interest you in some of our other desserts while you wait for the fresh batch." The bikers' displeasure was evident in their scowls and the way they shifted restlessly in their seats. After a tense moment, Razor spoke again, his voice dripping with barely concealed anger. "Fine. Just bring us some coffee for now. We'll wait for the new pie." As Emily hurried away to fetch their order, Charlie couldn't help but notice the way the bikers' eyes followed her, their gazes filled with a mixture of frustration and something darker. He had a sinking feeling that this situation was far from over, and that his peaceful afternoon at the diner was about to become anything but. The next few minutes passed in a haze of tension, with Emily bustling behind the counter to process both Charlie's and the bikers' orders. Charlie watched as she moved with practiced efficiency, her hands trembling slightly as she poured coffee into mugs. When she approached his table again, her smile was strained but genuine. "Here's your coffee, Charlie," she said, setting down the steaming mug. "I'll bring out your apple pie in just a second." Charlie nodded his thanks, but before he could respond, a shadow fell across the table. Looking up, he found himself face to face with the 3 bikers, Razor, Billy, and Tank, their names now visible on their vests. Their imposing figures loomed over him, creating a wall of leather and barely contained aggression. "Well, well," Razor sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Looks like we've got ourselves a greedy old-timer here. Ordering such a big piece of pie all for yourself, huh?" Charlie remained silent, his hand steady as he reached for his coffee mug. He'd faced down worse threats in his life, and he wasn't about to be intimidated by these bullies. Tank, the largest of the 3, leaned in closer, his breath hot on Charlie's face. "Remember me, old man? You bumped into me earlier. Can't even see straight, can you? Are you sure you can finish that whole piece of pie? You'll just get diabetic and those eyes of yours will roll right out of their sockets." The cruel laughter that followed Tank's words echoed through the now nearly empty diner. The few remaining customers had begun to quietly slip out, leaving Charlie increasingly isolated. Despite the mockery and intimidation, Charlie's voice remained calm as he addressed the bikers. "Gentlemen, I suggest you back off. You won't be getting a single spoonful of my pie." His words seemed to ignite a new level of hostility in the bikers. Razor's face contorted with anger as he reached for Charlie's coffee cup. In a show of dominance, he made a point of sipping from it before spitting the liquid back into the mug. "Listen here, you washed-up old-timer," Razor growled, leaning in close. "We can make things very unpleasant for you if you don't cooperate." Charlie's composure never wavered as he locked eyes with Razor. "I've fought much worse battles than this," he said, his voice low and steady. "You shouldn't try to mess with me." Billy, who had been silent until now, suddenly noticed Charlie's veteran hat. A cruel smile spread across his face as he chimed in. "Oh, look at this. We've got ourselves a hero here. Tell me, old man, how does it feel to be a washed-up vet whose service doesn't mean anything anymore? The words were meant to cut deep, but Charlie's expression remained impassive. He'd heard worse insults in his time, and these punks were nothing compared to the horrors he'd faced in war. However, the situation took an even darker turn when Tank decided to add his own brand of cruelty to the mix. "Hey, wait a minute," he said, his eyes narrowing as he looked Charlie up and down. "How do we even know you're a real soldier? I mean, look at your skin color. Are you sure you're not just some imposter trying to get respect you don't deserve?" The racial undertones of Tank's words hung heavy in the air, adding another layer of ugliness to the already tense situation. Charlie's jaw tightened, but he refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him react to their bigotry. Razor, emboldened by his companion's taunts, leaned in even closer, his voice a menacing whisper. "Here's how it's going to go, old-timer. Either we get a taste of that apple pie or we make sure you don't have it either. Your choice." Their laughter echoed through the diner as Emily watched helplessly from behind the counter, the plate of apple pie still clutched in her trembling hands. The confrontation had escalated far beyond a simple dispute over dessert, and Charlie found himself at the center of a storm of hatred and intimidation. But as he sat there, surrounded by the sneering faces of the bikers, a quiet determination settled over him. He'd faced worse odds before, and he wasn't about to back down now. The tension in the diner had reached a fever pitch. Emily stood behind the counter, the plate of apple pie clutched in her hands like a shield. Her eyes darted between Charlie, still seated calmly at his table, and the menacing figures of the bikers surrounding him. The choice before her was impossible: protect her loyal customer or give in to the threats of these dangerous men. Razor, sensing Emily's indecision, turned his attention to her. With slow, deliberate steps, he approached the counter, his eyes never leaving the plate in her hands. "Hand it over, sweetheart," he demanded, his voice a low growl that sent shivers down Emily's spine. Emily's gaze met Charlie's across the diner. The apology in her eyes was clear as she reluctantly surrendered the pie to Razor. She knew she was powerless to prevent what was coming, but the guilt of her action weighed heavily on her. Razor's triumphant smirk was chilling as he returned to Charlie's table, the prize held aloft like a trophy. With exaggerated ceremony, he dipped a spoon into the golden crust, breaking through to the warm, cinnamon-scented filling beneath. "Well, well, old-timer," Razor sneered. "Looks like you'll be serving us after all. Just like you used to serve the country, right? How about you feed each of us a bite, nice and slow?" The cruelty of the request hung in the air, a mockery of Charlie's service and sacrifice. The other bikers laughed, their amusement a harsh counterpoint to the tense silence that had fallen over the rest of the diner. Just as the situation seemed poised to escalate further, the sound of heavy footsteps drew everyone's attention. Emily had returned, this time accompanied by a tall, broad-shouldered man, her father, Brian, and the owner of the diner. Brian's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his tone making it clear that he knew it wasn't. His eyes swept over the scene, taking in the bikers' aggressive postures and Charlie's calm demeanor. Turning to the bikers, Brian's voice hardened. "I think it's time for you gentlemen to return to your own table, unless you'd like me to see to it that your bikes can't park in this establishment again." The threat, veiled though it was, caused a ripple of unease among the bikers. They exchanged glances, clearly weighing their options. Charlie, ever the peacemaker, spoke up. "It's all right, Brian. I have the situation under control. You and Emily shouldn't worry yourselves." His words, meant to diffuse the situation, only seemed to anger Razor further. As Billy and Tank reluctantly retreated to their table, where Emily had served their coffee, Razor leaned in close to Brian, his voice a menacing whisper. "You'll regret this, old man. There will be consequences for your actions." The threat hung in the air as Razor joined his companions, leaving Charlie alone at his table once more. The pie, the catalyst for all this trouble, sat untouched between them, a silent witness to the unfolding drama. Emily, her face pale with worry, rushed to Charlie's side. "I'm so sorry, Charlie. Let me make you a new coffee to replace the one they contaminated." Charlie nodded in gratitude, I'm covering the cost of the second cup, Emily. I won't let you bear the loss caused by their actions, he said, his gaze fixed firmly on the biker's table. He noticed Brian's jaw tighten as he vowed to ban the troublemakers from coming back. And please don't trouble yourself, Brian, Charlie said, his voice low and steady. You're putting yourself and this business at risk if you antagonize these men. I told you, I have this under control. Brian's response was incredulous. How do you control this situation? He asked, gesturing to the coffee stains that now marred Charlie's clothes and face. Come on, let's get you cleaned up. As Brian helped Charlie to his feet, guiding him towards the washroom, Emily hurried to wipe away the worst of the stains with a damp cloth. Her promise to call the police if the bikers acted up again was met with a subtle nod from her father. As they made their way to the washroom, Charlie couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions: anger at the bikers' behavior, concern for Emily and Brian's safety, and a deep-seated determination to resolve this situation without further violence. The fluorescent lights of the small bathroom flickered and buzzed overhead as Charlie stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft click. The harsh lighting accentuated the coffee stains on his clothes, dark patches spreading across the fabric like ink blots on paper. His reflection in the scratched mirror above the sink told a story of indignity. His grey hair darkened and matted with coffee, rivulets of the liquid running down his neck and staining his collar. With methodical precision born from years of military service, Charlie began the process of cleaning himself up. He placed his veteran's cap carefully on the edge of the sink, water dripping from its brim as he ran a paper towel under the faucet. The routine of it all, wet the towel, wring it out, dab at the stains, provided a moment of calm in the midst of the chaos that had erupted in the diner. As he worked, Charlie's mind raced, analyzing the situation with the strategic thinking that had served him well in combat. He knew the bikers weren't done with him yet. This momentary reprieve was just that. Momentary. He needed to be prepared for whatever came next. Just as this thought crossed his mind, the bathroom door creaked open. Charlie's eyes flicked to the mirror, watching as Razor, Billy, and Tank filed into the small space, their leather jackets creaking as they moved. The red dragon insignias on their vests seemed to glow menacingly under the harsh fluorescent lighting, a stark reminder of the danger they represented. The bikers' grins were predatory, as they effectively blocked the exit, trapping Charlie in the confined space. The air grew thick with tension, the smell of leather and sweat mingling with the lingering scent of coffee. "Well, well," Razor drawled, his voice echoing off the tiled walls. "Looks like the loyal customer needs a little privacy to clean up. How thoughtful of us to come and help, right, boys?" Billy and Tank chuckled, the sound devoid of any real humor. Their eyes never left Charlie, watching his every move like wolves sizing up their prey. "You know," Tank said, his voice dripping with false concern, "if you really cared about this place, about Emily and Brian, you'd have just given us that pie. Now look at the mess you've caused." Charlie remained silent, his hands stilling on the damp paper towel. He knew engaging with their taunts would only escalate the situation further. Instead, he focused on subtly shifting his stance, preparing himself for whatever might come next. Razor, interpreting Charlie's silence as fear, pressed on. "What's the matter, old-timer? Cat got your tongue? Or are you finally realizing that no one's coming to save you this time?" It was at this moment that Charlie decided to change tactics. Drawing on years of combat experience, he slowly moved his hand behind his back, mimicking the motion of reaching for a concealed weapon. The effect was immediate. The bikers' bravado faltered, their eyes widening as they considered the possibility that this seemingly harmless old man might be armed. "Gentlemen," Charlie said, his voice taking on a steely edge that hadn't been there before, "I think it's time we had a serious conversation about your behavior. I've fought for this country, bled for it. And I have to say I'm deeply disappointed to see that this is what I was fighting for. Men who think it's acceptable to bully and intimidate others over a piece of pie." The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly thrown off by this unexpected turn of events. Charlie pressed his advantage, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I've faced down enemies that would make you shake in your boots. I've seen things that would haunt your nightmares, and yet here I am having to deal with a group of grown men acting like schoolyard bullies. It's shameful, really." Charlie's words hung in the air, heavy with disappointment and barely contained anger. The bikers, who had entered the bathroom full of swagger and bravado, now looked uncertain, even afraid. They had come expecting to intimidate an old man, but instead found themselves face to face with a veteran who had clearly not forgotten how to stand his ground. As the tension in the cramped bathroom reached its breaking point, Charlie realized the next moments would be pivotal. He had successfully shifted the balance against his would-be attackers, but the atmosphere remained dangerously unstable. One misstep could send everything into chaos. Keeping his hand positioned behind his back, he maintained the illusion of holding a weapon he didn't actually have. The atmosphere in the cramped bathroom crackled with tension. Charlie's bluff about a concealed weapon had thrown the bikers off balance, their earlier bravado crumbling in the face of this unexpected development. Razor was the first to break the tense silence, his voice lacking its previous menace. "Whoa, whoa, old man, take it easy," he said, raising his hands in a placating gesture. His eyes darted nervously to Charlie's hand, still hidden behind his back. Billy, his face pale beneath his beard, chimed in, "We were just having fun, no harm done, right, guys?" He looked to his companions for support, but found only matching expressions of unease. Tank, the largest of the three, was the first to break. With a stumbling backward step that nearly sent him crashing into his companions, he began to retreat towards the door. Beads of sweat had formed on his forehead, glistening under the harsh bathroom lighting. Charlie maintained his stern expression, years of military discipline allowing him to keep up the charade despite the absurdity of the situation. Here he was, an old veteran armed with nothing more than a damp paper towel, facing down three leather-clad bikers in a dingy diner bathroom, and winning. Razor and Billy, seeing their hulking companions retreat, attempted to salvage what little dignity they had left. Nervous laughter bubbled from their throats as they too began to back away. "Come on, man," Razor said, his voice cracking slightly. "It was all just a harmless joke. No need to get all serious about it." Charlie remained silent, his steady gaze more effective than any words could have been. The bikers continued their retreat, their earlier confidence completely evaporated in the face of Charlie's unwavering resolve. The exit of the three men from the small bathroom was almost comical in its urgency. Tank led the way, practically shoving his companions aside in his haste to get through the door. The sound of their boots echoed down the hallway as they fled, leaving behind an almost surreal silence in the small space. As the door swung shut behind them, Charlie finally allowed himself to relax. He let out a long, slow breath, his hand dropping from behind his back to rest on the edge of the sink. The adrenaline that had been coursing through his old veins began to subside, leaving him feeling suddenly tired. Turning back to the mirror, Charlie resumed the task of cleaning himself up. He paid special attention to his veteran's cap, carefully wringing out the coffee-soaked fabric. As he worked, he couldn't help but reflect on the confrontation that had just taken place. It wasn't lost on him that he had just faced down three men young enough to be his sons, armed with nothing but his wits and the respect his service commanded. The cap's insignia, though damp, remained a proud symbol of that service. He held it under the hand dryer, watching as the fabric slowly returned to its original color. As he worked, Charlie's mind turned to what would come next. He had won this round, but he knew the situation was far from over. The bikers' retreat was temporary. Wounded pride had a way of festering, often leading to even more dangerous confrontations. With his cap dry and back in place, Charlie took one last look at himself in the mirror. The coffee stains on his clothes were still visible, but they seemed less important now. What mattered was that he had stood his ground, had refused to be intimidated. Taking a deep breath, Charlie prepared himself to return to the diner. He knew that Emily and Brian would be worried, and he wanted to reassure them that he was all right. But more than that, he needed to be ready for whatever came next. The bikers might have retreated for now, but Charlie's instincts told him that this confrontation was far from over. As Charlie emerged from the bathroom, the diner seemed eerily quiet compared to the tense confrontation he had just experienced. He made his way back to his booth, where a fresh cup of coffee steamed invitingly, courtesy of the ever-attentive Emily. Charlie took a moment to collect himself, his eyes drifting to the window where he could see the parking lot, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. Just as he was about to take a sip of his new coffee, the relative peace was shattered by the thunderous roar of motorcycle engines. Charlie's hand froze midway to his cup as he watched 3 more bikers pull into the parking lot, their chrome exhaust pipes glinting in the fading light. Each newcomer sported the same red dragon insignia that had adorned the vests of Razor, Billy, and Tank. Their leather vests were covered in various patches, indicating rank and territory, leaving no doubt that these were senior members of the same motorcycle club. Charlie watched as the original 3 bikers greeted the newcomers with obvious relief, their earlier bravado returning, now that reinforcements had arrived. The group exchanged words, with Razor gesticulating animatedly towards the diner. It was clear that they were being filled in on what had transpired inside. The bell above the door chimed ominously as the new arrivals entered the diner. Their leather boots thudded against the floor as they approached Charlie's table, the sound seeming to echo in the now nearly empty establishment. The few remaining customers retreated to the far corners of the diner or slipped out entirely, leaving Charlie increasingly isolated. As the 6 bikers surrounded his table, Charlie could see the subtle bulges under their vests that suggested concealed weapons. They made no move to reveal them, but the implication was clear. This situation had just become much more dangerous. Razor, emboldened by the presence of his superiors, leaned in close to Charlie. "Time to settle this like real men, old-timer," he sneered. "Outside, now." The irony of 6 men challenging 1 elderly veteran was not lost on Charlie, but he kept his face impassive. To everyone's surprise, including his own, he found himself nodding in agreement. "All right," Charlie said, his voice steady. "I'll meet you outside, but in 15 minutes I need to make a call first." The bikers exchanged confused glances, clearly not expecting this response. Razor's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "A call? To who?" "My backup," Charlie replied simply. "Since you're not alone, it's only fair that I'm not either." For a moment, the bikers were stunned into silence. Then, as if on cue, they burst into raucous laughter. Their mockery echoed through the nearly empty diner, bouncing off the walls and windows. "Backup," Tank guffawed, slapping his knee. "Who you gonna call, old-timer? Your war buddies from the retirement home?" Billy joined in, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe he's calling his old wife to come save him. Bet she's real tough with her walker and knitting needles." Razor leaned in closer, his breath hot on Charlie's face. "Face it, you lonely old man. You've got no one. It's just you against all of us." Their laughter continued, filling the diner with a cacophony of cruel amusement. Emily and Brian watched from behind the counter, their faces etched with concern. Charlie remained impassive, neither rising to their bait nor showing any sign of intimidation. 15 minutes, he repeated calmly. "I'll meet you outside." Razor's face twisted into a sneer. "Fine, but don't even think about trying to escape. There's only one door and we'll be watching it." As the bikers filed out of the diner, their mocking laughter trailing behind them, Charlie remained seated. He could feel the worried gazes of Emily and Brian on him, but he kept his eyes fixed on his coffee cup. Emily approached Charlie's table, her voice trembling slightly. "Charlie, maybe we should call the police." Charlie shook his head subtly, stopping her. "It's all right, Emily, I have this under control." "You kept saying that, but look at this. None of this is under control, Charlie. They will beat you and—" Charlie gave a nod and raised his hand, pulling an old flip phone from his pocket. Sensing that he had a plan forming, Emily stepped back behind the counter to give him some privacy. He dialed a number, speaking in tones too low for anyone to overhear. The next 15 minutes crawled by, each second dragging as Charlie sipped his coffee and worked his way through half of the generous slice of apple pie. Finally, Charlie rose from his seat, straightening his still damp veteran's cap with deliberate care. He approached the diner's door but paused to warn Emily and Brian, "Stay inside, both of you. Don't get involved, for your own safety." With that, Charlie pushed open the door and stepped out into the fading daylight, ready to face whatever came next. The tension built as the bikers waited impatiently, their boots scuffing against the asphalt. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, as Charlie stood facing the 6 bikers. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Razor, the apparent leader of the group, wore a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes as he addressed Charlie. "Time's up, old man," he sneered. "Where's this backup you were talking about? Or was that just a bluff to buy yourself some time?" Charlie remained silent, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The other bikers shifted restlessly, their earlier bravado giving way to impatience and a hint of unease. They had expected an easy target, a helpless old man they could intimidate for their amusement. Instead, they found themselves facing a veteran who seemed unnervingly calm in the face of their threats. Inside the diner, Emily and Brian watched the scene unfold with growing concern from the wide windows. Emily's hand hovered near the phone, ready to call the police at a moment's notice. But Charlie's earlier warning stayed her hand. He had assured them he had the situation under control, and despite their fears, they trusted him. As the minutes ticked by, the bikers' impatience grew. They exchanged uneasy glances, clearly thrown off by Charlie's composed demeanor. Razor, desperate to regain control of the situation, stepped forward. "Listen here, you senile old fool," he growled, his face inches from Charlie's. "I don't know what game you think you're playing, but it ends now. You've got 5 seconds to start begging for mercy, or we'll—" His threat was cut short by the distant rumble of an approaching motorcycle. All heads turned towards the sound, confusion evident on the faces of the bikers. This wasn't part of their plan. A large Harley-Davidson appeared on the horizon, its chromework gleaming in the setting sun. As it drew closer, the bikers' confusion turned to shock and then to fear. Charlie allowed himself a small smile as he recognized the rider. The motorcycle pulled into the parking lot, its engine purring to a stop. The rider, a tall, imposing figure in a leather vest covered in patches, dismounted with fluid grace that spoke of years of experience. The red dragon insignia on his back was more elaborate than those of the other bikers, marking him as someone of high rank within their club. The 6 bikers were visibly surprised to see their president arriving unexpectedly. They hadn't called him, and his presence threw them off balance. Quickly regaining their composure, they greeted him with forced enthusiasm. "Boss, you're here," Razor called out, a nervous edge to his voice. "Now we're even stronger than the old man. He doesn't stand a chance against all of us." Tank, emboldened by their leader's presence, sneered at Charlie. "Hear that, old-timer? You'd have to kill us all if you want to live a peaceful life from now on." However, their bravado quickly turned to confusion and then shock as Victor bypassed them entirely, heading straight for Charlie. The bikers watched, stunned, as their president warmly embraced the veteran, creating a tableau that left the gathered crowd speechless. "Victor," Charlie called out, his voice carrying across the parking lot. "It's been a while." "Long time no see, Charlie," Victor replied, his deep voice tinged with warmth. "You see, my club has gotten bigger since we last met." Victor's eyes scanning his club members critically. "And it seems some of them are acting all-powerful and mighty when I'm not around," he replied, his voice carrying both authority and disgust as he eyed the 6 bikers. The bikers shifted uncomfortably under Victor's stern gaze, the realization dawning on them that they had grossly misread the situation. Their earlier confidence evaporated as they watched their president standing shoulder to shoulder with the man they had been tormenting. "Boss," he stammered, "we didn't know you were coming. We were just—" Victor cut him off with a raised hand, his eyes never leaving Charlie. "Tell me, old friend," he said, his voice carrying a hint of steel beneath the friendly tone, "what exactly has my club been up to today?" Charlie met Victor's gaze steadily. "It seems some of your newer members have forgotten the meaning of respect," he said quietly. "They've been causing trouble over a piece of apple pie. My apple pie, of all things." As Charlie began to recount the day's events, the bikers' faces paled. They listened in growing horror as their president learned of their treatment of his old war buddy. Victor's expression darkened with each detail, his disgust palpable as he turned to face his club members. "Is this true?" he demanded, his voice sharp with anger. "You've been harassing my old war buddy over dessert?" The bikers shuffled their feet, unable to meet their leader's gaze. The realization that they had been tormenting a friend of their club president, a fellow Vietnam veteran no less, seemed to be sinking in. Charlie watched as Victor's commanding presence deflated the bikers' remaining bravado. The men who had seemed so threatening just moments ago now looked like chastised schoolboys, their eyes fixed on the ground as their leader berated them. Razor, attempting to salvage some dignity, spoke up. "Boss, we didn't know he was your friend. We were just having some fun, you know. No real harm done." Victor's eyes flashed with anger. "No harm done, you dare mock a veteran, a man who fought for this country? People like Charlie and I built this nation while you were still in diapers." The bikers flinched at Victor's words, the gravity of their actions finally sinking in. Charlie stood silently, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and weariness. Victor continued, his voice carrying both authority and disgust. "And all this over a piece of apple pie? You spit in his coffee and poured it over him? Is this what our club has come to?" The revelation of Charlie and Victor's shared history in Vietnam transformed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. The six bikers seemed to shrink under Victor's stern gaze, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. As Victor continued to dress down his club members, Charlie's gaze drifted back to the inside the diner. He could see Emily and Brian watching the scene unfold, their expressions a mixture of relief and confusion. He gave them a small nod, silently reassuring them that the situation now was truly under control. In a ceremonial display of authority, Victor ordered all 6 men to line up. With weathered hands that spoke of years of hard riding and harder living, he began to strip them of their club vests and patches. Each insignia removed marked their fall from grace. The red dragon patches that had seemed so threatening earlier now lay discarded on the ground like fallen leaves. "Remember who you were before I took you in," Victor said, his voice low and dangerous. "If you dare to return and harass anyone here again, I'll make sure you're as limp as those patches on the ground and won't be able to ride a bike for the rest of your lives." The bikers made desperate pleas for a second chance, their voices a chorus of "we were just having fun" and "no harm done." But their words fell on deaf ears. Victor's response was biting. "You think this is fun? Then consider yourselves expelled for fun. And count yourselves lucky that we didn't call the police. Make trouble again, and I'll personally ensure you spend the rest of your lives behind bars." As the confrontation reached its climax, Emily and her father stepped out of the cafe. The smell of freshly baked apple pie wafted through the air, momentarily distracting everyone present. Customers who had been watching the scene began to filter back into the diner, the tension slowly dissipating. Emily approached Razor, holding out a takeaway box. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was steady as she spoke. "Since you wanted this so badly," she said, "take it, but never return here again." Razor opened the box to find the cold, half-eaten apple pie, a final reminder of their disgrace. "Why are you giving me leftovers?" he protested weakly, his earlier bravado completely deflated. Brian, standing protectively near his daughter, responded coldly. "You requested the piece to be split, and you bought this so cheaply with your honor. We're not serving any of you again. Don't show your faces here or the police will hear about this. You heard what your ex-club president said." The 6 former bikers stood there, stripped of their patches and their pride, the reality of their situation sinking in. They looked at the cold pie, then at Victor and Charlie, then at the gathering crowd of onlookers. In that moment, they realized just how far they had fallen. Humiliated and stripped of their club affiliations, Razor cursed and threw the apple pie into the bin. Without another word, the 6 men climbed onto their motorcycles. The roar of their engines as they rode away seemed muted somehow, a far cry from the intimidating rumble of their arrival. As the dust settled and the sound of the motorcycles faded into the distance, a collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the gathered crowd. The confrontation was over, justice had been served, and the peaceful atmosphere of the diner was slowly being restored. Charlie and Victor exchanged a look of understanding. They had faced down enemies together before in jungles far from home. Now, decades later, they had stood together once again, this time in a small-town diner parking lot. The battlefield had changed, but the camaraderie remained the same. As they turned to head back into the diner, Charlie paused, looking at the discarded patches on the ground. "You know, Victor," he said thoughtfully, "sometimes the toughest battles are fought long after the war is over." Victor nodded, clapping a hand on Charlie's shoulder. "True enough, old friend, but as long as we stand together, we'll keep winning those battles." With that, they walked back into the diner. The two veterans settled into a booth, ready to enjoy a well-earned piece of apple pie, their conversation painting pictures of shared hardships and triumphs from their time in Vietnam. The diner's soft lighting and quiet atmosphere provided a perfect backdrop for their reminiscence, creating a sharp contrast to the earlier chaos. Other customers gradually returned, their presence signifying restored order. Emily and Brian moved among the tables with renewed confidence, while Victor assured them that the troublemakers wouldn't return. Emily approached their table. "I can't thank you enough for what you did today, Charlie," she said softly. "And you too, sir," she added, nodding to Victor. Charlie waved off her thanks. "It's what we do, Emily. We look out for our own, whether it's on the battlefield or in a diner." Victor nodded in agreement. "The war might be long over, but the bonds we forged there never fade. I'm just glad I got here in time to set things right." "You know," Charlie mused, "I came here today looking for a quiet meal and ended up in the middle of a confrontation. Funny how life works sometimes." Victor chuckled, raising his coffee cup in a toast to unexpected reunions and the sweetness of victory, in all its forms. Their cups clinked together, the sound echoing in the now peaceful diner. Outside, as the afternoon wore on, they prepared to leave. Charlie paused at the door, looking back at the booth where his day had started. So much had changed in just a few short hours, yet the diner remained a constant, a slice of Americana that had weathered this storm just as it had weathered so many others. With a final nod to Emily and Brian, Charlie and Victor stepped out into the cool evening air, their friendship renewed and strengthened by the day's events. The rumble of Victor's motorcycle soon faded into the distance, leaving behind a diner that had become more than just a place to eat. It had become a testament to the enduring spirit of those who serve and the unexpected ways in which the past can shape the present.